Okay, if there are no more questions, I would take the rest of this time before the break. So we will make a break at I think 2:45 to talk about this principle of agile, which is often closely connected to the concept of the user story. So I said at the beginning that you would also have the option to define a requirement specification up front. And this is what is often done in complex, and I think I forgot to put in the illustration for that. But so the contrast of the agile approach is in IT, it's called the waterfall approach. So waterfall approach simply means, and now maybe I can switch to. So the classic waterfall approach that we see in IT is as it says, it's basically a top down approach, and it starts at the bottom, at the top. So we start here, and usually we start with gathering the requirements. So that's basically you create a product that could be a software product, but it doesn't have to be. But let's assume it is. And then what you do is, so you ask the people who might be using this product later on what they want the product to do. So you do so the first thing that you do is actually the specification. Let's see if that works. So we have a specification at the beginning, and then the second would then be something like a design phase. So but the thing is, you do these phases step by step. So you go into a implementation maybe, and the next step on the waterfall would be testing, and then maybe you should have another one that says, okay, at the end we will go live. So this is a typical approach found in practice, and the idea is that we have these different phases that are performed sequentially. So we start with the specification, and then we write a document. In the case of a software specification, that document can easily be, I don't know, 100 or 200 pages. It's like a doctoral dissertation almost. So, and there you really detailed describe what the system should be able to do, and that's of course based on what the users told you when you started the project. And I will now have I don't know, maybe a timeline that's T0. So when you start the project, you ask the user, so what should the product or the project be able to do? That was too far. And then okay, so then you write that down and you have a document, and that document is then subsequently used to design and implement and test the product. And at the end, I don't know, maybe after 2 years or maybe 1 year, depending on how large the project is. So if it's a large IT system, it can easily be 2 years. 2 years later, you present the finished product to the user that you talked to in the first place at T0. But the question or the problem that arises is manifold, and the main problem is that so since you talked to the user 2 years ago, the requirements may have changed. So you may have a different requirement at the end of the project than at the beginning. So what you are building or have built in the 2 years and delivering to the customer is actually no longer what the customer needs. So this could be dramatically different because technology has changed and your software is already outdated, or the people who used to have these requirements are no longer part of the company, and you have different people now, you have organizational changes, you have a different department now. So all these things might affect, and processes change, might affect what the user actually needs in the end. So when you really strictly perform these steps as a waterfall, step by step, you run into problems at the end. And there's another problem that is based on communication problems. So when you talk to a user as an IT person, in the specification here, you might understand the user wrong. So you understand and you talk to him, and then okay, I got it, and then you write it down in the specification. And if there's no review process, and even if there is a review process, but the person on the other hand again thinks you understood it correctly, and from what you wrote down, it sounds like you understood it correctly, that doesn't mean that the next person here in this phase, in the design phase, will have the same understanding, because what is happening is you're passing down the document to someone else. He or she will read it and interpret it as whatever they understand, and then maybe design it based on that. And then you have maybe already some difference between the customer, the person who wrote the specification, and the person who does the design. And then once you hand it down to the implementation guys, these are then hardcore developers in the case of a software project. They have maybe a completely different understanding again of the functions that are described here, what should happen. And then once you go live, maybe you have a completely different product. And there's a nice image that depicts this. It's depicting this communication problem that I was referring to. So basically, this is always the same, supposed to be the same product, but people understand it differently. So how the customer described it is on the very left. It's this thing here, and then the project lead already has a different understanding, and then you give it to the analyst who designs it, and it's going to be this, and the programmer has a different understanding, and the customer really needed this, because customers often can't describe what they need in the first place. So when you ask someone about a product, what is it that you need? Sometimes they have, if it's a very new product, they have little imagination of what they actually need. And even if they do have, or think they have a very good understanding of what they need, it's sometimes not easy for them to describe it. So then they describe it maybe a bit differently. And then, of course, a person who is listening will have a different understanding of that again. And that's I think, depicted in this picture. So the problem of communication arises when you have this strict waterfall approach. And this is the slide, or the image that I was referring to and trying to build on the whiteboard. So basically the waterfall has these phases: specification, design, build, testing, and go live. And it's still very common in many places, not just IT, but in software. It's especially problematic because for the reasons that we just said. So there's no back channel between the different phases, and that makes it very prone to these problems, like the end product might not be what the user actually needs then, because time has passed, but also because the communication failed between those different phases and user groups who are working in those phases. Okay, so we have just talked about what is maybe problematic with the so-called waterfall approach that we often see in software projects, and not just in software projects. Typical projects are often planned in the same manner. We divide projects into phases, but there it's not that big of a problem, because we do not. Or it's not as big as a problem if we don't create any product in the end. So it always becomes a problem when we create a product and when we have uncertainty about that product. And that is usually the case. So most of the times when we develop a new product, and then that can again be software or anything else, there's always some uncertainty about the product. So one aspect, as we already said, is the user himself, who is probably changing their requirements over time, who is probably communicating in an unprecise manner, because that's just how humans communicate. Different people interpret stuff differently, and there are problems of communication along the chain. So these are all problems that arise. And how can now the agile approach, or a more agile approach, help here? And this picture here shows the difference between the classical waterfall approach and the agile approach. And I want to briefly describe what we see here. So on the bottom is basically what we just talked about. So we have a time scale, or a time axis, from left to right. So that's time passing by. And we do have a planned solution at the end of the project, or let's call this the planned product. And this would be the gray circle. And we always have some cloud or fog around it that should depict the uncertainty. But in the waterfall approach, what we do is we act as if this uncertainty doesn't exist, and we specify the product in the specification document as if it were exactly what we needed, and there is no uncertainty. So this is depicted here, and what we do then is basically we run through the project in a straight line, going through each phase, implementing towards that goal that we have specified in the specification. And in the end, as we have just said, when we have the go live, we might actually end up with this, but the user actually needed something like this. So that's because for the reasons that we've just said, so communication problems and requirements that might change, or other factors that might influence what is needed in the end. So what's the agile approach? So the agile approach is basically, the difference is upfront, it's that we involve the user, highly involve the user in the product development process. And the way we do that is by releasing so-called intermediate results. And we basically give the user early access to our first results, and we collect feedback on those iterations. And what's important here is this gray area that is basically an angle that points towards the planned product. And the angle at any point in time should show us how much range or how much space we still have for design decisions. So what can we decide at point 0 in our project? Well, it's very much that we can decide. We can decide almost everything. We can change almost everything about a product. But as we move forward and as we build parts of a product in the first version of a product, we make decisions, and those decisions cannot be easily undone. And that means our range of decisions that we can make becomes smaller and smaller with each iteration. So this is not used in the case of the waterfall approach, because there we have the range of decisions at the beginning, but we make all decisions up front, so we don't use it further along the project. But in the case of the agile approach, what we actually do is we make some decisions and towards the original goal, and then we have a first version at maybe this point. This could be 3 weeks into the project or 1 month, and we have a first functional prototype, a first functional version, and that already shows some of the functionalities. This could be, for example, that we have a very simple user interface with one functionality that the whole software will have in the end, and that we can show to the group of users that have originally specified what the product should look like. And then we can let them test. We can get feedback, so the users will give us the information. Yeah, this is great. This is as we expected. Or they will tell us, well, yeah, okay, but actually we would need a drop down here, and actually we don't need this information. This is too much. You can simply remove it. Or maybe we need another field, and so forth. So we get feedback, and then what happens is we incorporate this feedback into our next development cycle. And in Scrum, for example, which is a very specific agile methodology, we call these development cycles sprints. So if I say sprint, I simply mean a time of 3 or 4 weeks, which we call a development cycle in Scrum, a sprint. So in the next sprint, we then can use the information that we gathered from the user, the feedback, to make the product better and to implement changes and to react to the feedback of the users. And the good thing here is that we do not just give the user a solution in the end, and then the person or the user group sees the product for the first time. But in the agile approach, they will see the product many times in between, and this gives us the ability to actually change our course of action and make different decisions. And this is depicted here. So with each iteration or sprint, we will move the product into a slightly different direction. And this is the same point as here, but we will actually arrive at exactly this point in the best case, because we incorporated all the user feedback early. And in time, our goal actually moves in these. So this is basically depicting the change of the goal throughout the project, and in the end, where we arrive is what the goal at the end should be. So this is the agile approach, and it differs in a very important aspect. So we do not have a requirements specification, a very detailed document at the beginning, but rather we take these user stories which describe at a high level what the product should do, with not much detail on how this should look like in the end. But we get a good idea of what it should do, and then we can prioritize these user stories. We can maybe even create dependencies between those user stories, so we can bring them into an order, and then we start implementing them. And since a user story is always a complete functionality that the user can test, it can then be shipped with these first user stories. For example, the first iteration might contain 3 or 4 of the 50 user stories that we have. And these can then already be tested by the user, and feedback can be incorporated in the next sprint. So this is a much better approach, and so it's much better when you have uncertainty regarding the product. And this is usually the case. Of course, there are types of products that have been built 100 times, and we are building simply the same thing but in a different color. Then we wouldn't necessarily need this agile approach. But when we build a new product, and with software, it's usually the case that we have great uncertainty. Then it's beneficial to use the agile approach. So I just wanted to introduce that to you because it's closely related to how we work in our projects. But we do not use this project or this concept of sprints or anything that is actually coming from Scrum, but instead we use the user story, and we want to specify the user stories not upfront. We only want that one sentence, but once we get to actually implementing the user stories, then we will think about, okay, so what have we learned so far, how everything works, what does it mean for the current user story, and how can we make maybe changes to our plan. So we want to stay flexible, and we want to stay agile, and we do not want to have a large specification in the beginning. So to maybe make it a little bit clearer from a different example, what agile and not agile means. So if you want to paint Mona Lisa, like in this image, and the person who is painting it has maybe, or who wants someone to paint this picture, he has maybe an image in mind. So he could say, I want a woman in pastoral setting. And that's an idea of what the product should look like. And then in the agile approach, what we mean by these different iterations and functional releases is that we actually, in the first release, we would already have an outline of the picture and what the woman will look like and the background will look like. So the user can actually look at it and say, well, yes, that's what I want, or well, no, that's not what I want. And then we can get feedback, and we see part of the overall product already. And in the non-agile or not in the classic approach, we might build parts of the system. So we do not have a first function that actually gives us an idea of the product in the end, but instead we may have, for example, just one part. So for example, you could divide an IT system into the user interface, into the database, and then maybe something in the middle that we call application layer. So in the non-agile approach, or let's start with the agile approach. In the agile approach, we would build the user interface part, the application layer part, and the database part that is necessary to map a whole functionality so that the user can test it. So for example, the user should be able to create a customer with the system if it's a customer management system. And then we need the part of the database where the customer is stored, and we need the part of the application layer that handles the connection between the user interface and the database. So this would be the complete, all 3 layers would be partly implemented, and that's what we see here. And here, basically, we could say, okay, this is only the database. And we can have a specification, and we start, because we know how the database will look like. We have a whole specification created up front. we would simply start building the whole database, and then we start with building the application layer, and on top we build the user interface. That makes sense, but it is very static. And that means once we have created the database, there's no room to change anything. And this is maybe not a perfect an analogy, but it is depicting what we mean by agile. We always ship something that can be used, or where a user can get give feedback on. Of course, the user could give feedback here, but he doesn't see the rest of the women, so he doesn't know if it's going to be what the user wants in the end. So it's not a complete functional iteration. So the agile approach has basically a manifesto written, and it's summed up with these 4 sentences. So I want to go briefly over them. So it's individuals and interactions over processes and tools. So individuals and their interactions matter more than static processes and tools. That's just emphasizes that we need to work closely with the team, with the customers, and we need to actually emphasize what the customer wants and work very centric to the different people involved in the project. And then we can also step over certain defined processes and do something else, but rather take the individual and the interactions into focus. Just one sec. I needed to close my door. And then we have the second part of the manifesto, which is working software over comprehensive documentation. I think that is something, and I think you can all relate to that when you have a project and you basically have done all your experiments or the practical work, and then you need to write this report about it. And that's basically what we could mean by documentation. So you need to document what you did, and it's always something that nobody really likes to do because it's work that just needs to be done, but there's not really much fun in it, and nothing new will come from it. So that's in the agile methodology, we emphasize on the working software. So we'd rather have a working product than extensive or comprehensive documentation. Means that, for example, we don't have a comprehensive requirement specification. We start with very little, just these user stories, and then we try to detail everything we need on the way, and we try to rather come up with a working piece of software. Customer collaboration over contract negotiation simply means that we should collaborate with the customer, get feedback from the customer, show them be transparent in the work that we do, and show them early prototypes, rather than negotiating contracts and putting in like fines and service level agreements, stuff like that. And anything that we might put into a contract when we build a software. It's more important to collaborate and to talk to the customer and integrate the customer into the whole development process. And the most important thing, I think, is reacting to change over following a plan. So the whole manifesto, in the Agile Manifesto, is based on the idea that we can change, and the idea that change is part of the development project is inherent in the Agile methodology. So we actually built these discrete pieces or points where we can react to change into the methodology when we ship out a prototype or an iteration, and we get back feedback. So that's basically these 4 sentences that define the Agile Manifesto. If you want to learn more about it, it's the link is put on the slide. There are more details on the webpage. Okay. So that was a brief introduction, because it's, I think, important to understand, and maybe also interesting, because in many contexts you will be using this Agile methodology. It's very present in many companies today, especially, but not only in IT, but IT is definitely one of the leaders when it comes to Agile development, because it's just so important to be able to to be flexible and to react to change in software development.